Hello, this is Oscar Baechler here with the Dying Dimension, a board game project on Kickstarter, and we need your help funding it. $45 gets you a copy of the game. There are also levels for multiple copies of the board game, including a retailer level, or a special edition one. My marketing materials included a video of pieces moving around in space, and I started that project just with a background image that I painted up in Photoshop of, some abstract space goodness. So right now I'm looking at some reference photos. This Photoshop document is 720 by 1280, the size of the video render I use. Here is the Pillars of Creation, my favorite space paint picture, as it is for many people. Just galaxies, the Crab Nebula. I have particular methods that I prefer for putting reference photos into a Photoshop document. As you can see, I crop it big, and then I just assemble the reference photos around there because I don't like working with lots of layers, and additionally, I especially don't like having to turn layers off and on to see my reference photos. So what I end up doing is I crop much bigger than the document is to start with, and then I end up just keeping all my references on sort of a pegboard or a pinboard. I don't know the term. But way later on, I don't know why I forgot to do this right now, I end up flattening those down onto the background layer. Now here I have this layer. You can see I turned on pixel lock and movement lock, which you can find on the layers palette. And now I'm going to start by just using some abstract Photoshop processes to get a field of stars. Here I added noise and added noise again over it. And it's turned up so high that it's essentially becoming very black, very white, with very few dark spots. So I'm going to start by using Gaussian or Gaussian blur to mix that up a little bit. And then I can use levels to pull it way down, and now you can see we just have a very few amount of stars. I then copy this down and then flip it horizontal, I believe. I end up using another blur on this because this is going to be the fall off of the stars. The way light works scientifically, I'm probably not the expert on this, but it works in a quadratic format, by which I mean it starts with pinpricks of brightness and then fades off into lesser light. It's very rarely a strict transition from light to dark. So I set that layer to screen over my original stars so that we have this nice blurry highlight around them on top of these pinpricks of their hotspots. Now I created a new layer using my old one as a selection. You can option click on any layer's picture to get a selection from that layer. And now I'm just using the difference cloud filter over and over with random colors selected for my foreground and background color, and then inverting it, and then using Command F to repeat the filter over and over. And what we're going to do is use this to color the stars differently. Every time, every different star is going to have different chemicals and gases that make up its components. It's going to be shining through space at different wavelengths. There's all sorts of red shift, blue shift stuff that I don't understand going into this, but basically stars are not going to be uniformly one color. They're going to be burning in different ways. We have a yellow sun, as Superman would tell you. And then I'm using this layer that I created just set to, I believe I set it to a color layer mode transfer. You can with the layer mode tool selected, you can change any layer mode transfer on a layer using Option Shift plus and minus. And then that same is true for the brush tool. If you have the brush tool selected, plus and minus, or Option Shift plus and minus can scroll through all of your layer mode transfers, which is my preferred way to select them. So then I set that layer to a low opacity, and now these stars just have a little bit of color to them. Now I'm trying to start figuring out what's going to be this inside of this painting. As you can see, I have my reference photos there, and that's a good way to just sample off of to get a good starting color palette. I really like the sort of sea green that the space mist in the Pillars of Creation has. So I believe I color sampled off that. With the brush tool selected, you can hold Option to get the color picker. And here you can see my brush palette, which you can view by right-clicking with the brush. I've cultivated this over a long period of time in Photoshop. You should do the same for your own. If you just search online free Photoshop brushes, you can find lots and lots of things to download. Same thing goes for patterns. And this brush is a wet media brush, which I turned wet edges on. And for wet edges to work, you want a high flow and low opacity, as opposed to how I normally like to use the brush tool, which is high opacity, low flow. So you can see this is high opacity, low flow, and you don't get that wet edge. But if I change this to a flow 4, there is no edge whatsoever. But it's nice and spacey. If I wanted that edge, I would flip it. Right now I'm just toying around, trying to understand what's going on. Once again, the nice thing about painting in space is you get to be kind of abstract with it, but at the same time deal with real world stuff. So right now, I used the brush a little bit, and I think I got scared because I want to know what the composition is going to be first. So now I'm going to start producing an informal composition, which is a technique pioneered by Andrew Loomis, as shown in his book Creative Illustration, which I believe is out in print again, and you should go buy it. You start by dividing the horizon, and then dividing the vertical, and then you start just drawing vectors. Here I'm using the pen tool and then holding Command over the points to move it from whenever I need a new vector, and then right-clicking and saying stroke with the brush, or stroke path, and then it'll use the pencil tool if you select pencil. And so that's how I'm getting these lines, because normally when you want a straight line with the brush tool, you can hold Option and click one point and then another, and it'll draw a line between those 2 points. But I wanted it to intersect those 2 points, and so for that matter, I needed to use the pen tool. And additionally, it's got that nice fall off here. Once again, holding Command to move it around with the pen tool selected. And now you can start to get a sense of where the action is in this, or where it could be. Informal composition is great here because, once again, space is kind of abstract, and that's fun. Here I'm starting to see how some sort of nebula might swoop in, and the light might stream down from the upper left-hand corner. I don't know, I'm having fun with it. Once again, the project is The Dying Dimension. It's a board game, and this is just for the marketing materials. But I do hope that you go and support it. $45 gets you a copy of the board game. So now I set that layer to low opacity. Most people will tell you in their infinite wisdom after a while that less layers in Photoshop is better. And once again, that's the benefit of this big canvas. Even though it took me a while, later on I end up flattening those reference images down onto the background layer. I don't have it there now. But the reason that that's good is layers are more expensive than the size of the canvas in pixels, in my experience. So having less layers and a big canvas that you use to view all your images at once is, in my opinion, preferred. I'm using this nice soft brush that has lots of scatter on it to try and get an idea of what's going on. Here once again I'm playing with every layer mode transfer possible by holding Option, Shift, plus and minus. And really it takes a while to get an understanding of every single layer mode transfer, but it doesn't hurt to just hold Option, Shift and hit plus 13 times and view every possible option. It's a good way to get some pre-visualized idea of every possible color combo it is, and you'll probably learn something by doing it. Once again, playing with the brushes, I think that was coming out a little fast, so I switched to this nice soft textural brush, and I'm layering it in. And one thing that's bad that is happening is because I'm brushing with a low opacity, or with a high opacity, 100% opacity, and flow at 4%, it comes out very slowly and gently, which I like. However, when you do that, you're going to get artifacts from the brush. So anytime I zoom in, you can kind of see it. It's creating this sort of noisy pixel value to how the brush ink or the brush pixels came out. And later on, although I don't do it in this video, I went back and I went in with the blur brush and I just blurred out anytime I found that noise from having a low flow. So just be aware that that artifact is going to show up. Knowledge is power, so if you know it's there, you can go fix it. Here you can see I'm getting a sense that there's this gaseous blue atmosphere to the space, sort of ensorceling a central composition, which you can then have your eye drawn into. You can still see those guiding points from my informal composition. And now I'm doing something which I don't remember where I found out about this, but it's a really fun way to do space painting, which is I'm adding a outer glow set to color dodge with not pure white, but instead a very light color, and then with a big fall off. And then later on, I'm also going to add a drop shadow effect. However, with the drop shadow, I'm going to change it so that it too is a light color. Its layer mode transfer is set to screen, and then it has a lesser amount. And this is going to do that same quadratic fall off for the light, which, you know, people love on lightsabers. Lightsabers start super white and then bleed off to a lighter color or a darker color, and then finally a very saturated color. Lasers do it too. Everything glowy, and that's good in the world. Nice glowy stuff does that. It starts hot and then it fades out to a rich color. Now right now I think either the way I'm brushing or the current settings of those layer mode transfers, or not those layer mode transfers, the current settings of the effects are not where they need to be, so they're coming out pretty ugly. But to judge what how the layer mode transfer is working, you have to have something on there to mess with it. And clearly I didn't like that, so I just deleted it all. One thing to know about layer mode transfers is there's actual math behind them. Here I'm just moving that brush, which I love so much, closer to the front of my palette, so when I right click I can see it immediately. But as I was saying, layer mode transfers. Layer mode transfers are generally doing some sort of mathematical process to a pixel. For instance, multiply is taking any pixel value and multiplying it by a value of your brush, which is going to be somewhere between 0 and 1. Anything multiplied by 0 is going to be 0, by which I mean black. And anything multiplied by 1 is going to stay the same, by which I mean white has no effect. So that's why multiply lowers it. The thing to know about this is that because of how that works, you generally don't want to have pure white or pure black ever, because that's going to mean there's nothing for that layer mode transfer to work with in terms of adding and subtracting. So as you can see, I stopped using the pure black because it was just too aggressive. I'm once again using textural brushes that have lots of floofy stuff. I believe you can find this brush set by searching lynda.abr, which is Adobe brush set. I learned about this from a teacher of mine. I can't remember her name, but I remember that file, and somebody go give her some money. She does a great job. Here, once again, now I have something that's a little more organic, and I like. I'm playing with these things, and I did lie. I did end up using pure black, but that creates that interesting effect that a lot of the pillars of creation have, which is it's such a strange abstract material those are made out of. It's sort of a gaseous cloud, and they have a thin film of outer stars and stardust that has lots of glow and heat to them, but they're on top of this sort of black hole dark material that's, number one, blocking light behind it, and number two, sucking light into it. And it creates that really intense effect of some sort of light source coming off of the surface, but at the same time getting sucked in and blocking whatever light source is behind it. So that's looking kind of cool. And you know, I marked with a big star on my red composition guide where I thought the focal point was going to be, but I ended up having it, I think, be a little closer to where that big glow of light is coming out of that, you know, that kraken-like squid nebula. Now I'm playing with erasing away from the form. Just having lots of fun. I love space paintings because you don't really have to worry so much about what you're doing. You can be abstract, but at the same time, it ends up coming out looking like a thing that we all have seen and can identify with if you've ever been outside and looked up. I have some sense that this is looping around. Once again, I like that U composition. And you know, I'm brushing with a color that's not pure white. It's more of a reddish, or it's not a pure black, it's more of a reddish black. And in the end, that ended up contrasting pretty nicely with the nebula on the right, which is much darker, but the light coming out of it is much stronger. And you can see where that combination of the outer glow with color dodge, it makes a nice fall off that looks very spacey and very illuminated. Quadratic fall off. Google it. Still just trying to find an interesting shape with the brush tool and the erase tool over here. Although right now I have the composition lines turned off, you know, I'm starting to get a better feel for it, and you know, as you go, you can turn that off or even lower its value. Once again, this is for The Dying Dimension, a Kickstarter project, which you should go fund. There's even a $1 level if you are too poor, arguably, to be affording Photoshop. Once again, playing with brushes. Brushes are really fun to play with, and the more you play with them, the more you'll have an understanding of how Photoshop works. As you can see, I did end up flattening those reference photos down into the background. I don't know why it took me so long to do it, but I finally did. You can also see that I'm marking these layers with layer masks. Now what that means is you can make a selection, and then in the layers palette on the bottom there's a gray square with a white circle, and then you can click that and that'll make a mask on your layer, and that will enable you to just go kind of wild with the pixels where you're painting and not worry about the edges so much. And that's generally the way I like to work, because otherwise I end up turning the pixel lock on and off, and it's once again too complicated. But it also preserves that sense of where the document is going to be in the end, because we're not going to keep this cropped big forever. Now you can see I'm using a lighter color, and once again the brush is set to color dodge, and I'm just painting in some highlights around the edge. In addition to holding Option and Shift and then plus or minus to switch your layer mode transfers, you can also hold Option Shift and then hit certain letters to get layer mode transfers. So for instance, Option Shift D on a brush or a layer will change it to color dodge, and Option Shift C will change it to color mode, which is good for recoloring things. And then Option Shift M is multiply. Once again, similar to holding Option Shift and hitting plus a million times, hold Option Shift with the layer tool selected, and then press every letter on your keyboard, and you'll learn a hotkey. I'm still carving out the forms. I'm softening this right nebula. You can see where that composition is. I think pretty soon I'm going to start adding some star highlights, because I want these, this is pretty abstract. Why not just go with the formal choices that were made and put stars at all these intersections? we're gonna have stars anyways. And it also lets you put a very sparse amount of stars in front of these nebula, so that you get this sort of depth perception that they're blocking most of the stars, but there's 1 or 2 stars in front of them. So I'm just adding with a white brush or pencil, very, very strong dots here, and these are on their own separate layer. Another thing I ended up doing as well is, after all this, because there's so much color dodging and screening going on top of all these previous stars, you can see it here, they ended up getting sort of whited out. And so on the final one, although it's not in this video, I ended up going back, and then on the bottom star layer, which is layer 4, I ended up using the levels tool to reduce the amount of the midpoint of whiteness, and that ended up making it bleed out a little less. So they looked more like white hot spots bleeding out, as opposed to overblown, color dodged to death will-o-wisps. Here I am using the pen tool to make a little star formation. I'm not sure if this is the way to do it, but you know, all roads lead to Rome. This painting ended up taking about 50 minutes to make, so you know, is there a righter way to do it? I don't know. Is there a slower way to do it? Probably, and it's probably the quote-unquote right way. But right now, I'm just making a little pattern. I end up erasing away from it. I end up using the smudge tool to like drag out the arms of that glow, and that'll give it a bit more of a star-like glare to it. And then of course I'm using my favorite trick, which is color dodging everything. See in there, I just bring out some arms for it. And there you have a nice little star highlight. So these stars will look a little more powerful, a little closer, not so far into the depths of space. And now I clicked on the pixels by holding Command and clicking on the layer. I hid the selection with Alt H, or with Command H, and then I've been Option dragging off with the layer tool to drag out pixel selections as opposed to duplicate layers. And so that means these are all in the same layer and I don't have to end up merging them down, which would suck because then all of their outer glows would get merged into each other as well. And I prefer having that on one separate thing. So this is all happening on the layer, on one single layer with one set of pixels. You just can't see it because I hid it. And Command H, Apple H, is something I use a lot because it lets you get a sense of, it lets you judge by what it's gonna look like as opposed to the current selection. So this is starting to look pretty good. I've got highlights around the edges where the glow might be coming around those forms, and it's looking better than the first one I made that I used in the video, but I suppose that's the consequence of making 2 paintings to the same subject matter in a week, is you learn from your mistakes. Now lastly, I'm adding one layer with the same mask, which I invert, and then I fill the layer with pure black. So this is the matte that I end up using to view it. And this is about finished. I think the next step is going to be bringing it into Blender, which is a tutorial coming soon. Once again, I'm Oscar Baechler for The Dying Dimension, a board game on Kickstarter. At $45 you get a copy, so help fund us. Thanks.